Okay, we're back to inking page 2 of Ashes. And if you saw the last video I did, I was talking a little bit about David Mazzuchelli, and I was going over an interview he did in Amazing Heroes number 102, September 1st, 1986 edition. Um, it's a really good interview, and I found things that I connected with in the interview that he mentioned, that I connected to the type of work I'm doing now on my comic. So when I read these, I was pretty surprised at how, and it resonated with me. I'm like, wow, that's what I'm working on now. That's what I'm trying to figure out now. But one of the, if you, I'll go over the first part that I mentioned last time, or the only part that I mentioned in the last video I did. So he's talking. The interviewer is asking him about, what influences outside of comics, um, how influence outside of comics has affected his work. And so one part of one of his answers is, but I think you find that the people who are doing the most interesting work have some kind of wider range of experience to draw from. They're not just trying to do comics that follow all the patterns we've been seeing in the last 20 or 30 years. Later on farther down in the interview, they're talking about expressionism, and they even, the interviewer mentions, so Bill Sienkiewicz could be a contemporary comics expressionist. And in Mazzucchelli's answer, he says, cartooning takes an action or an emotion or a figure or a situation and tries to exaggerate it or bend it into a form that multiplies that feeling. And further down in the answer, he adds, what you have to do is take all those available tools that you have for exaggeration and manipulation and abstraction to make it come alive some other way. And on that point, he's talking about something he said before, which is comics are a static medium. You draw something and it doesn't move. It stays on that page, and you can look at it forever, and it's not going to do anything. So he's talking about, how can we give movement to a static image? And that's an interesting thing that I've been dealing with the creation of this comic, is how do I make something move? And furthermore, how can I tie that movement into some internal emotion that the character's having? I don't know if that makes any sense, but those are things that I'm kind of going through my head right now when I'm creating this comic. And the stories that I'm doing now by CM80 Jr., where they deal with existentialism and the afterlife and internal human conflict, it kind of helps that I'm working on those kinds of stories. So and then later on they talk about Mazzucchelli talks about losing a lot of the drawing, and the interviewer asks him, "What are you talking about, losing the drawing? What do you mean by losing a lot of the drawing?" And Mazzucchelli answers, "Well, getting rid of a lot of rendering that I was beginning to find extraneous." And the interviewer says, "And get to the essentials?" Mazzucchelli answers, "When you start making full renderings for each panel, they can be very beautiful, but they tend to slow down the act of reading the story that's supposed to be conveyed." And later the interviewer says, "Do you feel that by trying to recreate reality in comics, artists lose out on the dramatic potential of cartooning. This is an interesting one here too. Mazzuchelli says at one point, it's not enough to try to duplicate what we think we see and put that into the story, because it's drawing. For example, when you're drawing, you're able to turn the whole world on its end, to flatten things out, to make things huge, to bend the line in any number of directions. You can create a new reality, a reality of pen, a new reality, a reality of pen and ink, if you will. So that was interesting. I like that. So that's really what I'm. One of the other things that I'm working on now is that, and I mentioned it in the last one of the last videos, and how realistic should you make your comic in the sense of drawing, you know. And I said that that I like the comics that don't rely on realism, and I think, you know, a lot of times comics work better when they're not so closely dependent on realism. You know, because as he mentioned at one point, it's an exaggeration. You're exaggerating actions, emotions. You're exaggerating the lighting to give kind of a some sort of get an emotional response. But so that's so I'm playing with that part of making it believable that, for example, these two people here are talking, and that they're sitting down in a space. You know, trying to make it as much involving as I can, trying to give it as much depth and enough believability that you go, okay, I understand what's going on here. I'll go along with you. But then I'm trying to ask myself, you know, okay, where can I exaggerate some things? Like, where can I exaggerate it, and when should I exaggerate things? You know, and why am I doing it in the first place? Why am I even exaggerating anything? Why shouldn't I just draw it, you know, just like everything, draw everything like it's realistic, like it's in the real world. But you know, so I play with forms and shapes, different type of mark making. You know, trying different ways to apply the ink, and also different types of tools too. You know, how the ink is applied, like what tool I'm using to apply the ink to the paper, and how I'm using that tool, and how am I going to apply that ink with each unique tool. You know, so I've been playing with stuff like little rubber cake mixers. You know, using the rubber spatulas. Yeah, that's it, rubber spatulas, and seeing what kind of effect I get with that. Just, you know, different things. All to see, you know, and most of the time it's a failure. It's like it's it's something that I can't really use, or but you know, I don't really know what to expect when you're experimenting like that. So, you know, you get what you get, and then you keep at it, and you try to see how you can use the tool and to get what you need out of your story. Anyways, later in that same response, Mazzuchelli says, and if you make that reality coherent and believable, then you don't have to be bound by the laws of what we see in our everyday lives. Yeah, there's and that's, yeah, so you make it believable enough, so I'm hoping people will come with me. Yeah, I was just listening to a podcast and talking about how screenwriters or writers have to make things, in this particular instance they're talking about writing, how writers have to make things believable enough for the readers to have them jump off a cliff with them, because you don't know. Take a chance on the story, but it's got to be, I guess, believable enough for the reader to want to go along for the ride. And I think it's the same thing here. You got to make it the reality coherent and believable. Then you don't have to be bound by the laws of what we see. You still make it believable, but you can use the unique methods of this medium to make it interesting, and not just rely on reality on what we see, but we still believe it. That's pretty cool. Okay, and I just recently been reading about. I got this book last week. It's I've been reading about Dave Sim, and it's called Dave Sim Conversations. It's part of the Conversation series from, was it Mississippi University Press of Mississippi. It's a pretty good series they put out. I read the was a lot. The first one of the series I read was the Jeff Smith one. Jeff Smith interview. And what it is these are compiled interviews, and the collected interviews that were done in a certain amount of years of each artist, and they just publish them together. So it's pretty cool, and they give you a forward, and they give you some context, and then the rest of the book is just interviews. So I was pretty familiar with Cerebus. I never read a lot of the books when I was growing up, but I kind of had an idea of what it was and who Dave Sim is, but it's pretty cool to see what he has to say in his interviews. And I know there's been a lot of controversy for a few things on about his work and his life and his ideologies, but I mean, there's really no. It's hard to deny the impact that Sim made on self-publishing and independent creators. I mean, he even influenced, I think it was Eastman and Laird to do Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. So, and he's published Cerebus for 300 issues starting 1977 and ending in 2004. I think is when the 300th issue was published. So I mean, that's pretty amazing. But anyways, in the beginning, which is the first interview in the beginning of the book is by Maggie Thompson in 1982, and Maggie, and they're talking about characters and how Dave Sim parodied a lot of characters and people in his in the comic book, and so Sim talks about those characters propping up, those parody characters. He says you need a character for a specific function, and that's when it comes from. That's where it comes from. I need a character who's like this. Later on, he says, but there was a quality to it that wasn't going to work. He's talking about a previous character. Because the reason I wanted to introduce the character was so Cerebus would have somebody to talk to. So he's talking about these characters that he parodies. Like, why did you, well, I need somebody for a specific purpose to serve a function. So then I created this character. Cerebus needed to have someone to talk to. And it says here the same reason they introduced Jimmy Olsen into Superman. Sim continues, and that's basically all it is. You have to have a function in mind for the character, and then it either develops into a real popular character or it's just another one on the group. But I thought that was pretty interesting there, because I don't do any writing myself. I should, and I'd like to start. And I think it's because I never really thought of myself that way, which is too bad, because I think everybody should write. I think it's, even when I was forced to do it in school, to do essays, I did get a certain satisfaction after completing a piece of work, but it was kind of difficult for me. Even doing art isn't fun. It's still sometimes it's difficult and it's not easy. Problem solving, and it's not like enjoyable in the middle of it, but at the end it's pretty satisfying. But I never really connected with writing, but it's interesting to see how he forms his ideas, because he wrote and illustrated along with his partner in the book, Gerhard, who did the backgrounds, the meticulously hatched backgrounds, which are pretty awesome. But Sim is the one who does the writing and the heavy lifting of the book. It's his creation.